The small village of Solace nestled quietly at the edge of a dense and sprawling jungle. To its inhabitants, the jungle was both a source of life and an enigma, teeming with mysteries they dared not explore. Tales of strange sightings and inexplicable happenings had been passed down for generations, each more outlandish than the last. Among these tales, one legend stood out, a story of a guardian beast, half man, half beast, said to haunt the deeper parts of the jungle. Maria, a 24-year-old artist, had always felt out of place in Solace. After her parents' sudden passing, she lived alone in a modest cottage on the village outskirts, spending her days painting and sketching the lush greenery that surrounded her home. For as long as she could remember, the jungle had been her sanctuary. While others saw it as a place of fear and superstition, Maria found solace in its beauty. But the jungle wasn't without its dangers. The villagers warned her repeatedly. "Stay close to the edges, Maria. There are things in that jungle you don't want to meet." Maria would smile politely and nod, but the warnings never deterred her. One morning, she ventured deeper into the jungle than she ever had before. The air was thick and humid, the canopy above casting fragmented sunlight onto the forest floor. With her sketchbook in hand, Maria followed the call of a distant waterfall. Her heart raced with both excitement and unease as the sound grew louder. When she reached the waterfall, she gasped. The scene was breathtaking, an untouched paradise hidden deep within the jungle. Vivid flowers in every imaginable color lined the rocks, and the water sparkled as it cascaded into a crystal-clear pool. Maria sat on a nearby boulder and began to sketch, her pencil moving swiftly across the paper. As she worked, she felt a sensation that prickled the back of her neck, as though she was being watched. She froze, her pencil hovering over the page. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the dense foliage. At first, she saw nothing. Then, just beyond the trees, a shadow shifted. Maria's breath caught in her throat. From the shadows emerged a massive creature, its figure towering over any human she had ever seen. Its body was covered in dark, glossy fur streaked with silver, and its eyes deep and piercing locked onto hers. She should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the beast. But something in its gaze held her in place. There was no malice, no aggression, only curiosity. The creature took a cautious step forward, and Maria's heart pounded in her chest. It stopped a few feet away, tilting its head as though trying to understand her. I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered, unsure if it could comprehend her words. To her astonishment, the creature crouched slightly, making itself appear less intimidating. Maria's fear began to ebb, replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe. For what felt like an eternity, the two simply stared at each other, the roar of the waterfall the only sound breaking the silence. Maria cautiously reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of fruit she had packed for the trip, a ripe mango. She extended it toward the creature, her hand trembling. The creature hesitated, then reached out with a massive, clawed hand. It took the mango delicately, examining it for a moment before bringing it to its mouth. Maria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You like it?" she asked softly. The creature made a low rumbling sound, something between a growl and a purr. It wasn't threatening. In fact, it almost sounded pleased. Maria couldn't help but smile. She opened her sketchbook, her fingers moving instinctively as she began to draw the creature. To her surprise, it didn't shy away. It simply sat there, watching her with those intelligent eyes. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Maria knew she had to leave. She stood slowly, not wanting to startle the creature. "I have to go," she said, her voice tinged with reluctance. "But, thank you. For not eating me, I guess." The creature let out another soft rumble and stepped back into the shadows. Maria watched as it disappeared into the jungle, leaving her standing alone by the waterfall. When Maria returned to the village that evening, she couldn't shake the memory of the encounter. The creature had been unlike anything she had ever seen, not just in its appearance, but in its behavior. It had been calm, almost human. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the sketches she had made, Maria knew one thing for certain. Her life had just changed forever. The jungle's mysteries were far greater than she had ever imagined, and she had only just begun to uncover them. In the days following her encounter, Maria couldn't stop thinking about the creature. Its presence lingered in her mind, a mixture of fascination and curiosity. She spent hours flipping through her sketches, studying every detail she had captured, the streaks of silver in its fur, the intelligent glint in its eyes, the way it had crouched to appear less threatening. The villagers noticed a change in her demeanor. "You've been quieter than usual, Maria," said Mrs. Alvarez, the grocer, as Maria bought supplies. "Still going into that jungle, aren't you?" Maria smiled faintly. "Just for my sketches." Mrs. Alvarez frowned. "You ought to be careful. Strange things happen to people who wander too far." Maria thanked her and left, but the warning only strengthened her resolve. She needed to see the creature again. One morning, armed with her sketchbook, a small bag of fruit, and a mixture of nervous excitement, Maria ventured back into the jungle. She retraced her steps to the waterfall, her ears attuned to every sound. The jungle seemed different this time, more alive, more aware. When she reached the clearing, she paused, her heart racing. There was no sign of the creature, but the feeling of being watched returned. "I know you're here," she called softly. The bushes rustled, and Maria held her breath as the massive figure emerged once again. It moved cautiously, its eyes locked onto hers. This time, however, there was something different in its posture, less hesitance, more familiarity. Maria smiled, holding up a mango. "I brought you something." The creature stepped closer, its movements fluid and deliberate. It reached out and took the fruit, its massive hand brushing against hers for a brief moment. Maria's pulse quickened at the contact, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Do you live here?" she asked, knowing there would be no answer. "In the jungle, I mean." The creature tilted its head, as though trying to understand her words. It let out a low rumble, its gaze unwavering. Maria sat down on a nearby rock, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. She began to draw, her pencil moving swiftly over the page. The creature watched her intently, its eyes flicking between her hands and the paper. For hours they stayed like that, Maria sketching, the creature observing. At one point, it moved closer, peering over her shoulder. Maria froze, her heart pounding as its breath brushed against her skin. But it didn't harm her. Instead, it reached out and touched the sketch, its claw tracing the lines she had drawn. "You like it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The creature let out a soft growl, a sound Maria interpreted as approval. As the sun began to set, Maria packed her things and prepared to leave. She turned to the creature, a mixture of gratitude and reluctance in her expression. "Thank you," she said. "For this." The creature rumbled softly, its gaze following her as she walked away. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the sketches she had made. There was something about the creature, something she couldn't explain. It wasn't just an animal. It was more. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound outside her window. Maria sat up, her heart racing. Slowly, she crept to the window and peered outside. In the moonlight, she saw it, the creature, standing just beyond the edge of her yard. Maria's breath caught. It was watching her, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. She stepped outside, her bare feet brushing against the cool grass. "What are you doing here?" she asked softly. The creature tilted its head, then reached down and placed something on the ground. Maria stepped closer and saw a small bundle of wildflowers and fruit. "For me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The creature rumbled in response, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. Maria knelt down and picked up the bundle, her heart swelling with emotion. The gift was simple, but it spoke volumes. It wasn't just a gesture of kindness, it was a connection. From that moment on, Maria knew this was more than chance. The creature had chosen her for a reason, and whatever lay ahead, she was determined to uncover the truth. The days that followed were unlike anything Maria had ever experienced. The creature she now referred to it as Kael, a name she'd chosen on a whim, became a constant presence in her life. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kael would appear at the edge of her yard, bringing gifts of fruit, flowers, or smooth stones. In return, Maria would leave food and spend hours sitting with it under the starlit sky. Maria began to notice patterns in Kael's behavior. It didn't simply observe her, it seemed to communicate. When she spoke, Kael would tilt its head, rumbling softly in a way that felt almost like a response. It would mimic her movements, even replicating her gestures with surprising accuracy. One evening, Maria decided to test its understanding. She drew a simple picture in the dirt, a tree, a sun, and a small figure that represented herself. Kael watched intently, then picked up a stick and began to draw its own shapes. Maria gasped as the creature etched a crude figure of itself next to hers, connected by a line. You understand me," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. Kael rumbled softly, its dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. As their bond deepened, Maria began to open up to Kael about her life. She spoke of her parents, of the isolation she felt in the village, and of her struggles to find meaning after their passing. "They never understood me," she admitted one night. "The villagers, I mean. They think I'm strange for spending so much time out here. But with you, I don't feel so alone." Kael let out a low, mournful sound, its hand brushing lightly against her arm. The gesture was so human, so deliberate, that Maria felt tears sting her eyes. But not everyone in the village was oblivious to Maria's growing connection with the jungle. Rumors began to spread, whispers of her strange behavior and the mysterious figure seen near her home. One day, Maria's childhood friend Alina paid her a visit, her expression filled with concern. "Maria," she began hesitantly, "people are talking. They say you've been spending too much time in the jungle. Some even claim they've seen something near your house." Maria forced a laugh, trying to mask her unease. "They're just old stories, Elena. You know how this village is always making something out of nothing." Elena frowned. "You're my friend, Maria. I just don't want you to get hurt. The jungle, it's not safe. And neither are the people who don't understand you." Maria nodded, grateful for her friend's concern, but unwilling to share the truth. That evening, Maria sat on her porch, her thoughts heavy. She glanced toward the jungle, half expecting Kael to emerge as it always did. But tonight, the shadows remained still. "Where are you?" she murmured, her chest tightening with worry. As if in answer, she heard a soft rustling from the trees. Kael stepped into the clearing, its massive form illuminated by the moonlight. Maria's relief was palpable as she rushed toward it, but as she got closer, she noticed something was wrong. Kael's fur was matted with dirt, and a thin gash ran along its side, oozing blood. "You're hurt," Maria exclaimed, her voice trembling. Kael rumbled low, a sound that seemed to convey both pain and reassurance. Maria grabbed the towel from her porch and gently pressed it against the wound, ignoring the trembling in her hands. "I don't know who or what did this to you," she said softly, "but I won't let it happen again." Kael's gaze met hers, filled with an emotion Maria couldn't quite place, trust perhaps, or gratitude. Over the next few days, Maria tended to Kael's wound, their bond growing even stronger. Kael began spending more time near her home, often resting in the shade of the trees while Maria sketched or painted. She found herself talking to it as though it were a friend, sharing her hopes, fears, and dreams. But as their connection deepened, so too did the dangers surrounding them. The villagers' whispers grew louder, their curiosity and suspicion turning to fear. Maria knew it was only a matter of time before they took action. And deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that Kael's presence in her life was about to change everything, far more profoundly than she could have ever imagined. Maria awoke to a pounding on her door early one morning. The sound startled her, pulling her from a restless sleep. She opened the door to find Elena standing on her porch, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Maria," Elena said in a hushed tone, glancing nervously toward the jungle. "You need to come with me. The elders want to see you." Maria's heart sank. "Why? What's happened?" Elena hesitated. "They know something's been visiting you. People have seen it, Maria. They're saying it's the jungle demon, and they're scared. You have to convince them it's not dangerous." At the village square, Maria faced a crowd of wary, angry faces. The elders stood in a line, their expressions grim. "Maria," the chief elder began, his voice stern, "we've heard troubling reports. Several villagers claim to have seen a creature lurking near your home. You've been spending an unusual amount of time in the jungle. Tell us the truth. What are you hiding?" Maria swallowed hard, her mind racing. She couldn't tell them about Kael. They wouldn't understand. But before she could respond, Hank, a loud and aggressive villager, stepped forward. "She's protecting it," he spat. "That thing's been bringing trouble to this village for years, killing livestock, scaring our children. And now it's got her under its spell." "That's not true," Maria shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "It's not dangerous. It's intelligent. Kind. It saved my life." The crowd erupted into murmurs of disbelief. The chief elder raised a hand, silencing them. "Maria," he said slowly, "you're speaking of it as if it's human. Do you truly believe this creature means no harm?" Maria nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know it doesn't. You don't understand, it's more than just an animal." Her words did little to sway the crowd. By the time she returned home, Maria felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She found Kael waiting for her at the edge of the yard, its wound healing but still visible. "They're scared of you," she said softly, sitting down beside it. "And I don't know how to make them understand." Kael tilted its head, rumbling softly. Maria reached out, resting a hand on its arm. "You don't deserve this," she continued. "You're not a monster. You're so much more." The following weeks were a whirlwind of tension. Maria and Kael spent most of their time hidden deep within the jungle, away from prying eyes. But the more time they spent together, the more Maria began to notice subtle changes in herself. It started with exhaustion waves of fatigue that left her struggling to keep up with her usual routines. Then came the dreams. Each night, Maria dreamed of the jungle, vivid and alive as though it were calling to her. She dreamed of Kael, their connection deepening in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. One morning, as she prepared to head into the jungle, Maria was overcome by a wave of nausea. She doubled over, clutching her stomach, her breath coming in short gasps. "Are you okay?" Elena's voice broke through the haze. Maria shook her head. I don't know." Elena helped her inside, her brow furrowed with concern. "Maria, you need to see someone. This isn't normal." Reluctantly, Maria visited an elder woman known for her knowledge of herbs and healing. The woman examined her carefully, her sharp eyes scrutinizing every detail. "You're not ill," the woman finally said, her voice calm but firm. "You're carrying a child." Maria froze. "What?" The elder nodded. "The signs are clear. You're pregnant, Maria." Shock and confusion washed over her. It didn't make sense, she hadn't been with anyone. But then, as the reality sank in, her thoughts turned to Kael. The dreams, the connection, the inexplicable bond they shared, it all pointed to one impossible conclusion. Maria left the elder's home in a daze, her mind racing. Could it be true? Could Kael be the father of the child growing inside her? That night, as she sat with Kael beneath the stars, Maria found herself unable to keep the truth to herself. "Something's happened," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I think I'm pregnant. And I think it's yours." Kael's dark eyes met hers, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then, as if understanding the weight of her words, it let out a low, mournful rumble. "I don't know what this means," Maria continued, tears streaming down her face. "But I'm scared, Kael. Scared of what they'll do to us if they find out." Kael reached out, its massive hand brushing gently against her shoulder. The gesture, so full of understanding and compassion, made Maria's heart ache. "We'll figure this out," she whispered. "Together." But deep down, she knew their time was running out. The villagers' fear was growing, and the secret she carried would soon be impossible to hide. Maria's worst fears began to unfold in the weeks that followed. The changes in her body became impossible to ignore, and the whispers in the village grew louder. Her once quiet life was now under relentless scrutiny. One morning, as Maria walked through the market, she felt the stares of her neighbors boring into her. Conversations hushed as she passed, replaced by murmurs too low to make out, but sharp enough to pierce her already fraying nerves. "Have you seen her?" one woman whispered. "She's hiding something." "It's unnatural," another added. What else could explain it? Maria clutched her shawl tighter around her body, her heart pounding. She quickened her pace, desperate to escape their judgmental gazes. When she reached the safety of her home, she found Kael waiting for her at the edge of the yard, hidden among the trees. The sight of him brought her a brief moment of comfort, but it was fleeting. "They're going to find out," she said softly, sitting on the porch. "And when they do, I don't know what will happen." Kael rumbled low, his eyes filled with concern. He stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over her. Maria reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I need to protect you. And this child." Her voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. "But I don't know how." Kael knelt before her, his movements slow and deliberate. He placed a hand gently over her stomach, his gaze locking with hers. The gesture was so tender, so full of meaning, that Maria couldn't hold back her tears any longer. The next day, a loud knock startled Maria awake. She opened the door to find a group of villagers, their faces grim and determined. At the center stood Hank, his expression dark with suspicion. "Maria," he began, his voice laced with accusation, "it's time to tell the truth. What's going on out here?" Maria stepped outside, her pulse racing. "I don't know what you mean. You've been acting strange for weeks," Hank continued. "And now people are saying they've seen something big and dangerous lurking near your home." "It's just a wild animal," Maria said quickly, her voice trembling. "It hasn't hurt anyone." "Then why are you protecting it?" Hank shot back, his eyes narrowing. "What aren't you telling us?" Maria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, another voice cut through the tense silence. "Enough." The villagers turned to see Elena approaching, her expression firm. She stepped between Maria and the group, her arms crossed. "You're harassing her based on rumors," Elena said sharply. "Leave her alone." "This isn't about rumors," Hank snapped. "It's about protecting the village." "From what?" Elena demanded. "Maria hasn't done anything wrong. If you're so worried about the jungle, go patrol it yourself and leave her out of it." The crowd murmured uneasily, and after a tense pause, Hank grudgingly motioned for the group to leave. As they dispersed, Maria turned to Elena, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Elena placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to go through this alone, Maria. But you need to tell me the truth. What's really happening?" That evening, Maria sat with Kael beneath the canopy of the jungle, the stars barely visible through the dense leaves. Elena had insisted on following her, and now the three of them faced each other in a strange and fragile truce. Maria took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant," she began, her voice trembling. "And the child isn't normal." Elena's eyes widened, but she said nothing, waiting for Maria to continue. "It's Kael's," Maria said softly, motioning toward the creature. Elena stared at her, a mixture of shock and disbelief crossing her face. How is that possible?" "I don't know," Maria admitted. "But it's the truth. And I need your help to keep us safe." Elena looked at Kael, her expression softening as she studied the creature. "It's not dangerous," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's protecting you." Maria nodded. "But the villagers won't see it that way. If they find out, they'll kill him. And they might come after me and the baby too." Elena's jaw tightened. "We won't let that happen." The days that followed were a wind of secrecy and preparation. With Elena's help, Maria began gathering supplies and mapping out a plan to leave the village. She and Kael would have to disappear into the depths of the jungle, far beyond the reach of the villagers. But as they worked, the villagers' suspicion only grew. Hank and his group began patrolling near Maria's home, their presence a constant reminder of the danger looming over her and Kael. One evening, as Maria and Elena were packing supplies, Kael appeared at the edge of the clearing, his posture tense. He let out a low growl, motioning toward the trees. "They're coming," Maria whispered, her heart sinking. Elena grabbed Maria's arm. "We have to leave. Now." Maria nodded, her mind racing. She turned to Kael, her voice steady despite the fear gripping her chest. "Take us somewhere safe," she said. Kael rumbled in response, then led them into the jungle. The sound of the villagers' voices grew fainter as they moved deeper into the trees. Maria clutched her stomach, her resolve hardening with each step. For her child, for Kael, and for the fragile family they had become, she would do whatever it took to protect them. But she knew the battle was far from over. The jungle enveloped Maria, Elena, and Kael in its shadowy embrace, its dense canopy blotting out the moonlight. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath their feet, and the occasional distant call of a bird or animal. Kael moved ahead of them, his massive form blending seamlessly with the shadows, leading them deeper into the heart of the jungle. Elena kept close to Maria, her hand steadying her friend as they navigated the uneven terrain. "Do you think they'll stop looking for us?" Elena whispered, her voice low and uncertain. Maria shook her head. "Not as long as Hank is leading them. He won't rest until he's convinced we're gone or worse." Kael suddenly stopped and let out a low rumble, motioning with his hand toward a cluster of thick, towering trees. Maria and Elena followed his gaze and saw a hidden clearing, surrounded by natural walls of vines and rocks. In the center, a freshwater spring bubbled quietly, its surface glimmering in the faint moonlight. "It's perfect," Maria said softly, her voice tinged with relief. Kael led them into the clearing, his movements careful as though ensuring their safety. Maria sank onto a smooth rock near the spring, exhaustion overtaking her. Elena sat beside her, her eyes scanning the clearing. "We'll need to set up shelter," Elena said. "If this is where we're staying, we have to be prepared for anything." Maria nodded, but her gaze was fixed on Kael, who was circling the perimeter of the clearing. He stopped occasionally, sniffing the air and listening intently. Despite his immense size, his movements were precise and deliberate. "He's making sure we're safe," Maria murmured. Elena glanced at Kael, her expression a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. "He's more than I expected," she admitted. "I don't know what I thought when you told me, but he's not what I imagined." Maria smiled faintly. "He's not what anyone would imagine. That's why they're afraid of him." As the days passed, the three of them began to settle into their new sanctuary. Maria and Elena worked together to build a small shelter from branches and leaves, while Kael patrolled the area, keeping watch for any sign of danger. Despite the circumstances, Maria found moments of peace in the clearing. The jungle, once a place of mystery and danger, now felt like home. She often sat by the spring, her hands resting on her growing belly, talking softly to the child within. "I don't know what you'll look like," she whispered one evening, her voice carrying through the stillness. "But I know you'll be loved. By me, by Kael, and even by Elena." Kael, sitting nearby, let out a soft rumble, his gaze warm and steady. Maria smiled, feeling a deep sense of connection to him, a bond that transcended words. But the peace couldn't last. One afternoon, as Elena was gathering fruit near the edge of the clearing, she heard faint voices in the distance. Her heart sank. The villagers hadn't given up. She rushed back to the clearing, her breath ragged. "They're close," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to move." Maria's eyes widened. "We can't keep running. I don't know how much farther I can go." Kael let out a low growl, his posture tense. He motioned toward the deeper part of the jungle, his eyes meeting Maria's with a look of determination. "He wants us to follow him," Maria said, standing despite her fatigue. Elena hesitated. "Are you sure? What if it's too dangerous?" Maria placed a hand on Elena's arm. "We have to trust him. He hasn't let us down yet." Kael led them deeper into the jungle, the terrain becoming more treacherous with each step. The air grew cooler, the canopy above thickening until only slivers of sunlight broke through. Finally, they reached a cave hidden behind a cascade of vines. Kael ducked inside, motioning for Maria and Elena to follow. The cave was surprisingly spacious, its walls adorned with ancient markings that seemed to tell a story. Maria traced her fingers over one of the symbols, a figure that looked strikingly similar to Kael, surrounded by smaller figures. "It's like a history," she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. Kael rumbled softly, his eyes scanning the markings as though remembering something long forgotten. As night fell, the cave offered them a rare sense of security. Maria sat near the entrance, her gaze fixed on the jungle beyond. "We can't keep running forever," she said quietly. Elena sat beside her, her expression thoughtful. "What are you saying?" Maria looked at her, determination flashing in her eyes. "We need to find a way to make them understand. If they keep seeing Kael as a threat, they'll never stop hunting him or us." "That's easier said than done," Elena replied. "They're terrified of him, Maria. And people do dangerous things when they're scared." Maria placed a hand on her stomach. "Then I'll show them the truth. Not for their sake, but for my child's. They deserve a world where they don't have to hide." Elena stared at her, a mix of admiration and concern on her face. "You're braver than I am." Maria smiled faintly. "I'm just a mother trying to protect her family." Kael, sitting in the shadows of the cave, let out a low rumble. His eyes met Maria's, filled with an understanding that needed no words. Together, they would face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The peace of the jungle was shattered the next morning. Maria, Elena, and Kael awoke to the distant sound of voices and dogs barking. The villagers had found their trail. Kael was already on his feet, his body tense and his eyes scanning the cave entrance. Maria clutched her belly, her heart pounding as the realization sunk in. This was it. "We can't outrun them anymore," she whispered. Elena placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maria, we'll find a way. We've made it this far. We'll figure something out." Maria shook her head, her gaze shifting to Kael. "No. They need to see. They need to understand who Kael really is." Kael motioned for them to follow him, leading them out of the cave and toward a clearing not far from their hidden sanctuary. The markings on the rocks suggested this was an ancient meeting place, a sacred ground for something far older than the village. "They'll find us here," Elena said, her voice laced with worry. Maria nodded. "That's the point." As the minutes passed, the sounds of the villagers grew louder. Finally, they emerged from the jungle, Hank at the front, holding a rifle, with a group of armed men and barking dogs close behind. They stopped abruptly at the sight of Maria standing in the clearing, Kael towering protectively beside her. "There it is," Hank shouted, raising his rifle. "Stop!" Maria yelled, stepping in front of Kael. "You don't understand what you're doing." The villagers hesitated, their eyes flickering between Maria and the creature. "That thing is a monster," Hank barked. "It's been terrorizing this village for years, and now it's gotten to you." "No," Maria said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "You're wrong. Kael isn't a monster. He's never hurt anyone. He's protected me, protected us." Hank scoffed. "You expect us to believe that? Look at it. Look at me." Maria shouted, her hands resting on her swollen belly. The villagers' eyes widened, murmurs breaking out among them. "This child is his," Maria continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "And it's proof that Kael isn't what you think. He's not a monster. He's something more, something extraordinary." The clearing fell silent, the villagers staring at Maria in shock. Hank's face twisted with disbelief and rage. "You're lying," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're trying to trick us." "I'm not," Maria said. "I know it's hard to believe, but it's the truth. Kael isn't our enemy. He's part of this jungle, part of something much bigger than any of us. And if you just look past your fear, you'd see it too." Elena stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "She's telling the truth. I've seen it. Kael isn't dangerous. He's been protecting Maria and her child from the very beginning." Hank shook his head, his grip tightening on the rifle. "I won't let that thing threaten this village any longer." Before anyone could stop him, Hank fired a shot. The sound echoed through the jungle, and Maria screamed as Kael lunged forward, shielding her with his massive body. The bullet grazed his shoulder, but he didn't falter. Instead, he let out a deafening roar, the ground seeming to tremble beneath them. The villagers stepped back, fear etched into their faces. But as Kael stood there, his chest heaving, he didn't attack. Instead, he knelt before Maria, his eyes filled with pain and unwavering loyalty. Maria turned to the villagers, tears streaming down her face. "Do you see now? He's not fighting you. He's not your enemy." The villagers murmured among themselves, their fears slowly giving way to uncertainty. Hank raised his rifle again, but before he could fire, one of the older villagers stepped forward. "Enough," the man said, his voice firm. "Look at them, Hank. Does that look like a monster to you?" Hank hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It's dangerous. You don't know what it's capable of." "Neither do you," the man replied. "But maybe it's time we stop letting fear make our decisions for us." The villagers slowly lowered their weapons, their expressions a mixture of fear and curiosity. Hank, however, remained defiant. "This isn't over," he growled before turning and storming back into the jungle. As the tension in the clearing eased, Maria turned to Kael, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. Kael rumbled softly, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet strength. The villagers began to disperse, their fear tempered by the seeds of understanding. Elena stayed by Maria's side, her gaze lingering on the jungle. "You did it," Elena said softly. "You made them see." Maria nodded, a small smile breaking through her exhaustion. "This is just the beginning. But it's a start." That night, Maria, Elena, and Kael sat together beneath the stars. For the first time in weeks, the jungle felt peaceful. Maria rested her hand on her belly, her heart filled with hope for the future. "We'll find a way," she said, her voice firm. "For us, for Kael, and for this child." Together, Kael let out a low, contented growl, and Maria knew they had taken the first step toward a new life, one built on understanding, courage, and an unbreakable bond. The jungle was quiet the next morning, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. The villagers had retreated, their anger and fear tempered by the confrontation in the clearing. For Maria, Elena, and Kael, it felt like the first breath of peace after weeks of tension. Maria sat by the spring in their sanctuary, her hands resting on her growing belly. The child within her had become a symbol of hope, a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. Kael stood nearby, his eyes scanning the jungle as if still guarding against unseen dangers. Though his wound from the previous night's encounter had stopped bleeding, Maria knew it must still ache. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying through the stillness. Kael turned to look at her, his dark eyes filled with the quiet understanding that had become their shared language. Elena emerged from the small shelter they had built, carrying a bundle of fruit she had gathered at dawn. She sat beside Maria, her expression thoughtful. "The villagers will talk," Elena said. "Some of them might even come back. But I think you've planted a seed. They saw something last night, something they can't deny." Maria nodded. "It's a start, but it won't be easy. People don't let go of fear that quickly." Elena glanced at Kael, who had moved closer to the spring, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the water. "He's remarkable," she murmured. "They'll never see the world the same way again if they let themselves believe in him." "That's the hardest part," Maria said. "Believing." Later that afternoon, as the sun filtered through the canopy, Maria noticed something unusual near the edge of the clearing. Kael was arranging stones and branches in deliberate patterns. At first, she thought it might be a game or a way to pass the time, but as she watched, she realized the shapes weren't random. Kael was creating a simple but elegant design that mirrored some of the ancient markings they had seen in the cave. Maria knelt beside him, her heart racing. "What is this?" she whispered. Kael rumbled softly, pointing to the symbol, then to Maria's belly. "It's for the child," Maria realized. "You're giving them a name?" Kael nodded, his eyes meeting hers. Maria felt tears welling up. "You're more than they'll ever understand," she said. "But I'll make sure this child knows. I'll make sure they know who you are." That evening, as the jungle came alive with its nocturnal symphony, Maria made a decision. "I need to go back," she said to Elena. "What?" Elena asked, alarmed. "To the village? After what happened?" Maria nodded. "I can't hide forever. If I don't show them the truth, if I don't give them a reason to stop fearing Kael, they'll keep hunting him." Elena hesitated, then sighed. "You're braver than I am." Maria smiled faintly. "I'm just tired of running." The next morning, Maria returned to the village alone. The walk felt longer than usual, every step weighed down by the uncertainty of what she would face. When she reached the square, she saw the villagers gathered, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Hank was there, his arms crossed and his jaw set in defiance. Maria took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I know you're afraid," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But fear isn't the answer. It never has been." The crowd murmured, but no one interrupted. "You've seen Kael," Maria continued. "You've seen how he protected me, how he spared you even when you tried to hurt him. He's not your enemy. He's part of this jungle, just like we are. And if we can find a way to live together, we'll all be stronger for it." Her words hung in the air, the silence stretching. Finally, an older villager stepped forward. "What do you want us to do, Maria?" he asked. Maria's gaze swept over the crowd. "I want you to give him a chance. Stop hunting him. Let him be." He's not here to hurt you, he never was. Over the weeks that followed, a fragile truce formed between the villagers and the jungle. While not everyone was willing to let go of their fear, many began to see the truth in Maria's words. They left offerings at the edge of the forest, fruit, flowers, and other gifts, as a gesture of peace. Kael remained hidden, but Maria felt his presence every day, watching over her and the child they shared. Months later, Maria gave birth in the sanctuary of the jungle. Elena stood by her side, offering support as Maria brought a child into the world, a child unlike any other. The baby had Maria's eyes but bore the unmistakable strength and features of Kael. As Maria held her newborn close, tears streamed down her face. "You're a miracle," she whispered. "A bridge between two worlds." Kael watched from the shadows, his dark eyes filled with pride. Years passed, and Maria's child grew strong and curious, their existence a testament to the bond that had defied fear and prejudice. The villagers, though wary, began to accept the presence of the jungle's guardian, and the truce between their two worlds held firm. Maria often sat with her child near the spring, sharing stories of Kael and the courage it took to stand against fear. One day, as the sun set over the jungle, Maria looked out toward the horizon, her heart full of hope. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. "And it's a beautiful one."